The European View podcast. Your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal, brought to you by the Martens Centre. With Sara Pini.
Hello and welcome to the European View podcast, your new way to navigate through the main issues of our policy journal with valuable insights from the author themselves. I'm Sara Pini, Senior Research Officer at the Martens Centre, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Marco Bitschnau, a postdoctoral researcher at the Chair of Sociology of the University of Constance. And together we will speak about an article that he published in the latest issue of the European View, which is titled Seeking Attention, Provoking Reactance, Radical Climate Activism After COVID-19. Of course, you can find these and all the other articles of the European View on our website, martencenter.eu. So welcome, Marco, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, I told you already, but I repeat it here. I really enjoyed your article. I think it's well written, it's sharp, it's even witty. So thanks for the nice read.
That's a pleasure to hear. Thanks a lot for the compliment.
So your main argument is that the new and more radical form of activism, of climate activism that emerged after the pandemic, has three inherent flaws, which could not just weaken the message, but also jeopardize everything that has been done so far and even the public acceptance of climate policies. Can you detail these three weaknesses?
So certainly, I think the point of departure here is that the form of activism we witness right now and that I'm writing about is mainly revolving around creating attention at all cost. So what we had before were like these mass protests, remember all Fridays for Future, which gathered hundreds of thousands of mostly young people in the streets. And what has emerged after the pandemic is a form of activism that is more like based on guerrilla-like tactics, based on disruptive protest, and as I said, based on creating attention. And attention, don't get me wrong, is a very important thing, right? One could even say it's the most important political currency of the 21st century. But focusing so strongly on attention comes with a certain cost, I think. It is a remedy that has severe side effects, three of which, as you said, I outline in my article. The first one basically is attention is highly volatile, and protest tactics focusing on attention are what one could call a depreciating asset, right? I'll give you an example. You all know these tactics of throwing some color, some tomato soup, some potato soup, I don't know what exactly it is in some cases, on a painting or on the glass panel protecting a painting as a sort of form of protest. And the first time you do this as an activist, it creates a huge outrage, right? The media reports about it, and everybody's asking, how dare you violate and vandalize such a precious piece of art? And you really get the attention you want to have. Second time you do it, sometimes, yeah, you still get some attention. Third time, perhaps a bit less. And by the 10th or 11th time you do it, nobody will take notice anymore, right? So at some point you're trapped either in a cycle of escalation. You have to escalate your tactics all the time. You know? You go for a Rembrandt next time, or the Mona Lisa, or the Eiffel Tower. Or you have to radicalize yourself and get to even more violent methods of protest. So you're really trapped in this cycle. This is the first thing, I guess. Second thing is, these strategies often depart from the assumption that the main issue is that people are not aware of climate change yet, right? So the base idea is often we have to create attention and direct attention towards the issue, and then people will have a different level of awareness and realize how important combating climate change actually is. And we should put much more energy into that. I would say most people, most policymakers also are very aware of the challenges we're facing. And the issue is not so much that people don't know about this stuff. The issue is rather how to reconcile our efforts to combat climate change with our efforts to, for example, also make a just transition that helps everyone and that does not really put the burden, the economic burden and the social burden, on already marginalized groups or on certain industry factors, right? So this is, I think, an important factor here we have to consider. And the third thing, and there's I would say, a certain perverse irony to it, the more you focus on attention, the more the attention is about yourself and not about the subject you want to, direct it towards. So all the times when we had like these activist groups, think about Last Generation in Germany, Just Stop Oil in the UK, there are several others, when they make these big disruptive protests, well, in the end, what the media reports about and what the politicians talk about is about how to deal with these groups, whether one should prosecute them, whether they should pay some fine, whether this is like legitimate from a democratic perspective. The only thing about which people don't talk is, in fact, the issue, climate change.
Right, and all this that you described creates what you call reactance, what sociology, I understand, calls reactance,
Absolutely.
right? So a reactance in the public opinion toward the message, toward the means used, and what I find most interesting, toward the public identity of these activists. So how does this psychological mechanism work?
So I think reactance is an issue that obviously comes along with what I just described, but which also has a dimension on its own. What reactance is, in very, very basic words, is an inner resistance that people experience if they feel they are pressured to change their behavior, to adopt certain views, and so on and so forth, and they don't want it, right? And the more you push them to do it, the less they are inclined to do it. I mean, just think about a little boy or something, and you tell him to clean up his room, and the boy says, no, I don't want to. And the more you pressure him and threaten him and tell him he has to, the less the boy is inclined. Well, perhaps not the best example because we're not talking about children here in this context. And obviously the parents in this case have a position of authority over the boy. Here we have a different structure, right? Here we have a certain group of activists who do not represent society at all, at least not in the sphere of perception. People perceive them as very urbanized, very academic, very out of touch often. And they tell people not just to adapt the behavior a bit, but they want to transform people's lives, right? They tell them, okay, we really have to change policies in a way that will affect your material well-being, personal liberties. Think about like fewer cars or more expensive air travel and so on and so forth. And they don't have a democratic mandate to bolster that, right? So what do people do? They see these activists gluing on the street, resorting to some forms of protest that are not like, what the majority thinks is an adequate form of protest. And they say, well, if these people are in favor of these tactics, I'm against them all the more, right? This is a natural psychological reaction, I think. And the dangerous thing here is that people then often associate these activists with climate protection measures, which are important more generally. And then sometimes it can happen that someone who would be in favor of protecting the environment and combating climate change has a certain kind of animosity towards the issue because of these encounters with radical activists which do not represent the climate movement at all, right?
Right. Uh, and of course, in your article, you speak about climate movements and climate activists, not really green parties per se, right? But I think we can draw some parallel here, nevertheless, especially in view of the results that these parties had in the last EU election. Do you think that this reactance mechanism was at play too?
This is a very interesting question. I was thinking about it quite a bit. First, I think it's really important that we make the distinction first between like these activists and the green parties, which, as we all know, are quite a diverse bunch in Europe. In Germany, for example, the case I know best, the situation is quite muddy because the Green Party is currently in government, as we all know, occupies the Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of the Economy, and the activist groups, notably Last Generation, are completely against the Green Party and say, okay, you have basically betrayed the movement. You're not doing enough. You're not pushing like Chancellor Scholz enough to actually introduce ambitious climate protection measures. They even started their own list for the European elections, which I think received 0.3% in the end. So there is some sort of like distinction that is important here. But since you asked for the parallels, I think on the level of perception, there are very similar patterns indeed, that many green parties, which were perceived as some kind of breath of fresh air a few years ago, think about 2019 when the situation was completely different, no COVID, no economic crisis, no inflation, are nowadays perceived as parties that push certain issues without really backchanneling to the general population, right? And that they really come up as aloof in a certain way that is not healthy for green politics at all, right? And I can imagine that many voters really feel that they are pushed in a way that really affects their personal well-being, their material well-being, their economic safety, and that they associate this feeling of being pushed with like green parties, especially since green parties sometimes espouse this kind of rhetoric in the public sphere. So I think it's important to make this distinction. So not all green parties are following this activist course, and I know of quite a few green parties who have really, some kind of pain in their stomach when they are confronted with these issues because they know how toxic they can be to the more moderate part of the electorate. But on the level of perception, I think the mechanisms can be very much the same, depending on the context.
Yeah, exactly. It's a perception. This is really what, when you were speaking about reactance, so this is what rang a bell, especially when toward the end of your article, you have a sentence that I think it was really meaningful, and I quote, there is probably no image more detrimental to their cause than that of some middle-class student activists lecturing a working-class delivery driver on the perils of global warming. And end of quote. This is what really rang a bell to me. This perception of being out of touch, and then you said a bit elitist also. Would you agree that this also kind of applies to green politicians and voters?
I mean, there I think are two different levels to answer this question, right? I mean, empirically, we know quite well green voters, green party members, at least in the cases I know, they are disproportionately well educated, disproportionately more likely to have an academic degree and to be well off financially and to live in big cities and metropolis. And obviously, this shapes the image of the party more generally, right? So, how the party is perceived by the general electorate. And then obviously, this also, you know, brings forward certain types of people that are engaged in the party and that shape the public image of the party. So I am not surprised at all if many people think, well, these Green Party functionaries and members, these are people who can afford climate change, and they let us know that they can afford it. They live in big cities, they don't need cars. I need a car, right? They are well off, they have a nice pension, I don't. I cannot afford like CO2 taxes and this kind of stuff, right? So I think this really shapes the image of these parties, and it's based on some empirical foundation. And the same applies to the electorate of these parties. In Germany, it's really very visible, actually, that in the last European election, they had really, really high voter shares in the big cities, in the well-off districts, but not so much anywhere else, right? And then, obviously, this is basically the culmination of the stereotype. If you have like activist groups who are not working, who are students, I love students. It's a great thing to be a student. But obviously, being a student activist has a certain cloud in the public imagination, right? If you're a student activist, people will assume, well, you don't know the real life, you don't know how to work really hard for your money, and all this kind of stuff. And this all contributes to this public perception of you not really understanding that many people struggle already with the kind of transformation we have today, and will probably struggle even more if we pursue more ambitious climate goals. You can still be in favor of pursuing these goals, but you should be aware that this comes at a cost, right? You only can spend a year once. And this is a thing I think it's really important when we talk about pursuing ambitious climate goals, that we need to be aware if you spend €1 on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's a euro you cannot spend on education or healthcare or pensions or anything else. And people know that, And I think many people perceive these green parties in general, but especially these kind of activist groups, as, really giving the impression that this is not the case. And there appears some kind of gap, basically a canyon.
And this brings me to my next question, because so how to ensure that this public support to climate policies that are fundamental, because despite the doomsday scenario, again another similarity with your article, drawn up by the Greens during the campaign in case of a victory of the right, it doesn't seem that the Green Deal per se is at risk, or that climate policies per se are at risk. But it will for sure get a more or less drastic makeover. How much of a makeover will also depend on the public support it will be able to gather. So, what would be your suggestion to the next commission on how both to shape and to communicate green policies, climate policies, so that they don't face the same backlash?
That's the million-euro question, right? Not easy to answer. So first, I would agree with your sentiment. I think the Green Deal is fine, but you're right. I mean, the pressure is getting higher, and the critical voices are getting louder and will be getting louder in the future. That's, I think, very clear to see. Now, there's the saying, like, all politics is communication these days, and so I think we should start with, like, how to communicate things. And here I think it's really important to focus on honesty and transparency, to be clear about what goals can be reached realistically and that they will come at a cost, that people will have to sacrifice something. I think this is really important because often the climate discourse, there's this idea, okay, we just have to set out some ambitious measures and we just have to commit. And commit is a hollow term. What does commit mean? Commit means you need funds. You have to spend money on that. You have to take money from somewhere else. And this should be part of a democratic process, or should be communicated in a way that people know what is at stake, but also what it will cost. So that the black box can be enlightened, so to say, right? I think this is really important. And this comes along, obviously, with a need to make it appear, at least appear. Best case, it is not like that, but to make it at least appear that it is not part of a top-down process, which I think is often the problem with many things that happen in the European Union, that people at the base level perceive it as being very top-down heavy, right? That there is a decision that has been made over their heads, and that does not really take into account the struggle they are facing or might be facing if the policy is implemented. So I think this is really important that this is considered, and then also that the goals are realistic. That's, I think, a given. And that certain concerns that have not been properly addressed in recent years, that there's a strategy to address these concerns quantitatively. I give you an example. For instance, I know a lot of people who really don't understand why Europe has such ambitious climate goals, when in other parts of the world, emissions are rising and rising at an incredible stage. And then people are, why should we sacrifice right now when in China or India, there are new coal mines being opened and I don't know what else. And obviously there are arguments to say, you can say, okay, we have to be a role model for the world, we are more advanced, we can afford it, and so on and so forth. But I have found these arguments to be not that convincing to the general population. So you have to be clear about what you want. You have to be clear that this will come at a cost. What does cost mean for many people? You have to probably implement measures that balance out some social imbalances that will result as will be the result of these policies. And then you have to come up with convincing answers to these questions and concerns that many people share. And this does not mean you should, just say you're right, we will stop it here. But you have to be prepared to these concerns. And this is really important, I guess.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting discussion.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me.
So for those listening in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and discover other interesting insights of the European view on our website, martencenter.eu, and on our social media channels. Thank you and stay tuned for more.
This was the European View podcast, your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal. Follow the Martins Centre for more.